Good morning. I'm Bill Fallon, and I'm delighted to be able to kick off this special session about 9/11 on the 20th anniversary. I'm sure all of us have memories of that event or that day, depending on where you were. But today we're going to go back and talk with some of the senior Navy leadership who was in place on 9/11 of 2001. I think it might be worthwhile for me to begin by kind of setting the scene of the days and weeks and months leading up to 9/11. And I'll start with the previous summer of 2000. Admiral Vern Clark came in as the new CNO, and it wasn't very long after that, in October, that the Cole was bombed in Yemen. We had a significant loss of Navy life there. And that really began to focus national attention on the terrorist problem. Despite that event, I think there was little to no real understanding of what might happen the next year. But following the Cole in October, for Navy, we had a major event in February of the next year, 2001, with the Greenville collision with the Japanese training ship. And then a couple of months later in April, the collision between the EP-3 and the Chinese fighter off of Hainan Island. So the Navy was very busy, lots going on, many events. In the political background, you may recall 2000, the national elections, very close between Bush and Gore. That administration, the Bush administration, came in January. Secretary Rumsfeld was the new secretary. And as we got closer to 9/11, the Honorable Gordon England was now the Navy secretary. And that was the setting for that fateful day, which I believe changed pretty much everything in people's lives all over the world. Many months and even some years later, commentators would wonder and question aloud, when do things return to normal? And my answer is that it was a new normal. Things were never going to be quite the same, and certainly not in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. So this had a huge impact on the American psyche. I think almost every individual in this country had just a different feeling, uneasiness for starters, a lot of anxiety. And then shortly thereafter, the attacks, once it became clear who had perpetrated these attacks, going back after Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and then the war on terror began. And again, this was a tremendous focus for the administration, and a lot transpired not long thereafter the attack into Iraq and so on. But these events were mind-boggling at the time. And frankly, in Washington, my impression was there was lots of confusion, lots of uncertainty. But one thing that really stood out, and I think we'll get a sense of that today, was that our Navy fell back on what it was used to doing, what it was trained to do, and that is people taking the initiative, taking actions. But there was also a tremendous human dimension of this. And throughout the entire Navy, throughout the world, individual responses, individual actions really made a huge difference, not only that day, but in the days to follow. So I'd like to introduce Admiral Vern Clark, our CNO back in those days, to give us his perspective on what was going on and what went on. Vern, over to you.
Thank you, Admiral Fallon, and good day to everyone. 9/11 at 20 years, and I have to tell you, it doesn't seem like 20 years to me. And I think that's in some reason because the events of those days are so indelibly etched in our memory. I have noticed, it does seem to me at least, that each year as it goes by, I don't feel the same sense of urgency that we felt back then, and I don't think there's any way that it could feel that way to people who didn't actually experience it. And we know that today we have young people who barely know what it was like on 9/11, 2001. I do believe this 20th commemoration is different, and I'm glad for that. And I want to thank the Naval Historical Foundation for their invitation to be part of this. I think this is very valuable to record. My story actually starts with the USS Cole. I've been the Chief of the Navy for just a couple of months, and the Cole event literally changed our perspective of life in the 21st century global security world, in my view. But I also think it was an important distinction for the Navy because while the global war on terror started on 9/11 in 2001, the Cole attack really brought the Navy into that new world a little over a year earlier. And I wanted to just start my story about 9/11 by going to September 10th. On September 10th, I was in the Washington Navy Yard at a ceremony welcoming the Prime Minister of Australia, who was there along with his counterpart, the Chief of the Naval Staff of the Australian Navy, David Shackleton. And the President of the United States was there, and the Navy and Marine marching groups were there, and we had a pass and review, and it was a beautiful day. The reason we were there was President Bush wanted to honor Australia. And some of you will remember that early on in World War II, the Australians lost one of their ships, the HMAS Canberra. At the time, we were building ships so fast that it was almost incomprehensible in World War II. And so our nation decided to name one of our cruisers over their heavy cruiser. We named it ours the USS Canberra to honor the nation of Australia. And frankly, that's what friends do, especially at a time like that. Well, years later, our ship was decommissioned, and one of the things we always do when we decommission our ships is we save the bell, we save the helm, and a few other artifacts. And that day, our president presented Prime Minister Howard with the bell of our Canberra. It was all grand, both formally and informally. The next morning, I was trying to catch up on things because I had 3 or 4 days before I'd returned from a trip to the Pacific Theater. When the first plane went into the towers in New York City, I was in a meeting with Admiral Fallon and one other person. My EA came in to report that a plane had gone into the towers. At the time, I remember thinking that some person had had a medical emergency or something in a small civilian aircraft and must have flown into the building. The vice chief and I pressed on with our meeting, and we all know that a few minutes later, the second plane hit the towers in New York again. By then it was on TV, and I remember the EA barging in and announcing the shocking truth. As that happened, I remember getting up and going over to my phone bank in my office. I had a telephone system there with 40 or 50 hotlines on it. Went to places like the National Military Command Center, the White House Situation Room, to all the global commanders and chiefs, our Navy components worldwide, and so forth. And of course, all of the director codes inside the Navy staff. I immediately hit the button for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and his EA answered and said, I said, where is he? And he said, he's in Europe, sir. I hit the vice chairman's button, and the EA answered there. And I said, and where is he? And he said, he's on Capitol Hill. And I asked him if the next steps were in progress, like changing the DEFCON and so forth. And he didn't know. And I was reliving my days, actually, when I asked those questions of being the J3. I'd been the director for operations working for the chairman on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A few minutes later, I hit another button and I called Bob Natter. That would be Admiral Bob Natter, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Atlantic Fleet. And the conversation was very short. And I just asked him, what do you have it operating at sea? And do you have a carrier? And he mentioned that there were some carrier qualifications going on out there, and that, yes, there were some missile shooters at sea. But the message of the call, as short as it was, well, whatever you have out there, they haven't asked for them yet, and they haven't had time, but crank it up. And his story and those of our Navy has not often been told, and it says so much about the way the U.S. Navy reacted on that fateful day. As Admiral Fallon indicated, there were a number of crises that first year that I was sitting in the seat, and of course Flight 77 hitting the Pentagon and our command center, where we lost 43 lives, 10 other members of the Navy family in the airplanes. Bill and I were still ensconced in our meeting when the blast hit the building. And within a very short period of time, the smoke was coming down the passageway. And I'm sure Bill described it, and I won't do it again, but the staff was saying, you got to get out of here. And I asked if they had called the command center, and the answer was yes, but there was no answer. We were about ready to leave the office, and I remember stopping at the door and looking around, and then said to the staff, we need to look around one more time, one more check, because we may not be back here. Then I was to depart, and we had a site that we were going to. Before I left, I wanted to go to the National Military Command Center, where I had been in charge as the director for operations working for the chairman. Bill Fallon, the vice chief, and I joined up on the way in the passageway going down toward the command center. And over the next few hours, I would find out that the chairman actually was flying to Europe, and he was getting ready to, in fact, they had reversed course, and they were coming back to the U.S. I remember that day filling out as we went to the Navy Yard, and Bill Fallon went in a different direction. Both of us agreed that we shouldn't be in the same place. We did not really know what was unfolding. How many attacks were there going to be? What did this wave look like? We went to NCIS at the Navy Yard, and I really haven't ever talked about that publicly before, but I think it's fine to talk about it now. We would get reports from the command center from time to time about false alarms, other airplanes coming. But Tim Keating and his team had already gone to work. And I'll know you'll hear that story about reestablishing the command center in short order. Before I left the building and got to NCIS, as I was leaving the parking lot, Vice Admiral Pat Tracy came out of the Pentagon, and I saw her in the parking lot, and I went over to her and I said, Pat, find our people. And this lesson came from the experience with the USS Cole. I remember so vividly how important it was to get information to the families on the USS Cole. And of course, we didn't have good communications with them early on in the process, and so it was delayed some. With this situation, I knew immediately we needed to do everything that we could to identify any members that we might have lost. And so I gave Pat Tracy that calling, and it's my understanding that and not just to create, get a team together, whatever you have to do, and told her where we were going to be. I got a call at 1 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of December. Admiral Tracy saying, we have found them all, and we have lost 42 people. Well, the 12th was full of all kinds of things going on. And it started with the chairman was back, and there was going to be a meeting with them. But first I met with the members of our team. The Marines were gracious, and we didn't have a space. We actually lost over 80% of our spaces. And we had called for a meeting with our direct reports, and that included civilian SESs and the flag community and so forth, up at the Navy Annex, where the Emergency Command Center had been established. And when we joined there, I just would say, as he said, started the meeting by just going around the table and asking them to fill us in on where we were in the journey and what the circumstances were in their areas of responsibility. When they completed, my message was relatively short. Excuse me. My message was relatively short. And basically, I said, we're at war. And we all need to understand that we are at war. That war has been not declared so far, but we're at war. And then I think the more important message and things that people might have not thought about. We had established an emergency command center, but we did not have a headquarters. And I said to each one of the people sitting there, because they were all responsible for, had areas of responsibility inside the Navy headquarters structure. We have a command center now, but we don't have a headquarters. We have 400,000 sailors out there. The nation is counting on us to respond when called upon. Today, our tasking, you and me, each one of us, by tonight or tomorrow morning, we need to have established a new Navy headquarters. And remember, this is our time to serve. This is our calling right now. We owe this to the fleet. This isn't about us. This isn't about doing this for ourselves so we have a place to work. And we're not going to find a place to work like we had yesterday before the explosion occurred. We're not going to be able to run up and down the passageway and discuss situations. We're going to be stationed at various places around town. But by tomorrow, we need to have our headquarters reestablished, even if it's in some diminutive way, so that we're ready to support the United States Navy and the citizens of this country, provide a Navy that can respond to any calling. Let me jump to the end of the day. At 1800, the president came to the Pentagon, and you'll recall that he was in Florida and didn't get back in town until late in the middle of the afternoon on the 12th. And by the way, when the explosion occurred, the Secretary of the Navy was not in town either. And one of the things that did happen, the command center had worked hard to get his plane cleared back in town, and he joined us late in the day on the 11th. In the Navy Yard. The president walked into this meeting. It was a small room. I'll never forget this. And the table was small for the Pentagon, to be sure. And the Joint Chiefs were there. The Vice Chairman, as I recall, wasn't there because we were keeping individuals separate. So the Deputy Secretary of Defense was not there, but obviously the Secretary of Defense was there, Secretary Rumsfeld. And President Bush walked in. There was no chatty, how are you, everything today. He sat down, he turned to Rumsfeld and said, do you have an update? The update he gave was so short. It was very clear to me that they'd been talking frequently because the update was short, and that meant to me that they'd been staying in touch. And then without any further ado, he looked at Secretary Rumsfeld and he pointed his finger at him like this. And he said, don't you ever forget yesterday. And then turn to the next person. Don't you forget yesterday and what happened here. And each one of us around the table, one at a time. Don't let the tyranny of urgency cause you to forget what happened yesterday. And he got to the end of the table and he looked at us all and he said, I promise you, I will never forget. And with that, that meeting was over. And he stood to leave. And as he was leaving, my seat was just next to the door on that side of the room. He stopped right there in the doorway, turned to me and he said, Vern, isn't it amazing the difference that 36 hours makes. 36 hours ago, we had not been attacked. 36 hours later, this world really has changed forever. And I said, yes, sir, it certainly has. And with that, he was off and on his way. And so were each of us. 9 days after the attack, on the 20th of September, there was a session called on Capitol Hill, a joint session of Congress. The House and the Senate joined together. And the president was to address the nation and the Congress. There was a wonderful feeling of unity there that night. In fact, it was the best speech that I ever heard President George W. Bush give. That night, we were sitting on the front row as members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And about halfway through the speech, he paused before he said, I have a message for the military. He paused again, and then he said, your time will come and you will make us proud. Well, what so many people didn't know at that point in time, 9 days after the attack, I was already so proud of the brilliant way the United States Navy was responding. The sons and daughters of America who chose to wear the uniform, they were off doing very important things. Next, we're going to hear from a person who can tell us so much about all of those things. And I'm so happy to turn this over to Bob Natter. Bob, over to you.
Thank you, Admiral Clark, and thank you, Admiral Fallon, for recording for posterity the actions of our Navy on 9/11 and the days following. These testimonies are especially important now, 20 years after the fact, because the fog of memory is starting to set in for many of us. And also, some of the participants that day have obviously passed away. So the importance of getting this history accurate and down for posterity is going to be important. So you and your staff really deserve a lot of credit for not only this endeavor, but also the others that you do with the Navy Historic Foundation. I have asked a number of folks to help me with my recollection of this, and I've contacted over the last week about 12 people who were actively involved on down at the fleet level on September 11th, 2001. My immediate staff that day, for the entire day, were my Executive Assistant, Captain Al Myers, Special Assistant, Commander Steve Cade, and my aide, Lieutenant Commander Keith Davids. They were with me literally the entire day, one or all of them, and they have helped me in my recollection of the events that day. So on September 11th, the morning's major event, of course, was the aircraft accident or supposed accident flying into the World Trade Center's, one of the Twin Towers. That had everybody's attention. Actually, we had assumed that that was probably an accident. Many of us did, in fact. While starting a morning meeting that day, my phone rang, and New York City's Deputy Mayor Rudy Washington called to ask for assistance due to the significant damage to the first tower. And he was involved heavily with the evacuation and first responders to that building. The mayor, Rudy Giuliani, actually had gone down to the site to help in any way with the first responders. After the fact, I asked Rudy Washington, why in the world did you call me? And he said, well, the fact is, because of the experience with the city and the Navy Review on July the 4th, the year before, as well as the Fleet Weeks, mine was the only military officers that he and Rudy Giuliani had in their phones. And so he called me asking for help, that and the close relationship the city had with the Navy. While starting a meeting that day, as I mentioned, Deputy Mayor Washington called and asked for assistance. He specifically suggested the hospital ship, and he also asked for any other assistance we might be able to provide regarding construction equipment. And cranes and that sort of thing. As we were talking, the second aircraft actually hit the second tower. And at that point, everybody in the Earth knew that this was not an accident. This was an intentional act. He asked for air assistance, and then I hung up. At that point, I got a call from the CNO, Admiral Vern Clark, who basically said, we're in big trouble right now, and to do whatever we need to do with the fleet to respond accordingly. That call lasted about 15 seconds because he was on the phone with others trying to coordinate efforts up in DC. The next calls were in quick succession following the collapse of the first tower. I was actually again on the phone with Deputy Mayor Washington, and at that point he said in the conversation that he was afraid the mayor was dead because he had gone down to help right at the tower, and he had no communications with the mayor at that point. He asked again for assistance, the hospital ship, and asked also if we could provide air cover. I told him I'd have to get back to him, and then I immediately called Vice Admiral Mike Malone, who was Commander of Naval Air Forces in Norfolk, and told him that the GW, the USS George Washington, was underway, and we needed to get some aircraft out to it right away, armed, and we needed to check in with the North American Air Defense Command, who should have had control of this operation. I also very quickly called Vice Admiral Cutler Dawson, commander of the Second Fleet. He was en route from Suffolk, Virginia, in his car going to the flagship, the Second Fleet flagship. I told him to go directly to the helicopter pad and get a flight out to the GW and join it. He did that right away and got out to the ship. I called Admiral Malone and said, look, we needed to get some aircraft armed out to the GW. It did not have an air wing embarked because it was just going through its initial phase of deployment preparations and was down essentially for a shakedown cruise. They had no air personnel on board. That was the only direction I gave to Admiral Malone. He in turn called over to Naval Air Station Oceana, talked with the CO there, called CAG 17, commander who was just starting workups again for deployment. And they sat down with the CO of the base, along with CAG 17, CAG 7, CAG 3, to try and put together the right aircraft and also maintainers and people who could operate the aircraft on board the ship. After about an hour, I called back to Admiral Malone, asked him how the arming of the aircraft and launches were going. He asked for a waiver on loading ordnance, missiles, and gun ammo on the carriers so that could be done out on the flight line as opposed to going to the safe area for loading ordnance. I told him the waiver was granted, and that saved a lot of time in the deployment. The people involved there for this effort were people that I contacted in preparation for this session today. The Roger Welch, who was the CAG 17 commander, got together with those other CAGs, decided which aircraft were up and ready, and we had a mixed bag of aircraft actually fly out there. From the time the tower fell and the attack on the Pentagon, 3 hours later, the first aircraft landed on board the USS George Washington. GW did not have an LSO aboard. So the Force LSO got in a helicopter, flew out there, and was there in time to bring the first aircraft aboard. That was 3 hours after the attack on the Second World Trade Center and the Pentagon. This is reflective of what the people on the ground, the commanders, the commanding officers, the initiative they took to get this thing underway based on one phone call and one command from me to Admiral Malone, and that was essentially get some aircraft out to the GW. They worked this very professionally. They got them out there very quickly. We also went down to the command center at the Fleet Forces and Atlantic Fleet Command Center. And down there, I walked over to the lieutenant on the console, who was Lieutenant Jennifer Coutures, and she was on the watch there. I asked her what to determine some cruisers that had missiles aboard, get them underway immediately and send them up to the Chesapeake Bay to provide air cover for the District of Columbia, the capital, and also to check in with Second Fleet out on the GW. By the time this happened, we also, at the same time, we knew that the command center for the Navy was out of commission because of the attack. So IT Chief David Woodward actually was down there at the command center and on his own initiative started to establish communications as a backup for the Navy's command center. Later that day, Admiral Fox Fallon called me from up at the old Bureau building where he had gone to check in with the Marine Corps Command Center and has established secondary comms up there. So our stand-in comms did not have to be stood up for that long, but we were there and acting as a secondary command center for the Navy's command center. The overarching reality is that on 9/11, the fleet responded professionally and quickly with very little guidance from me, and the fleet went into action. Every commander at every level exercised the charge of command. They knew what their responsibilities were. They had very little direction, and they acted with great courage and great alacrity to get the job done. We actually, when the GW was underway, we did not have a plane guard, either surface ship or helicopters. Helicopter actually deployed from Florida, flew up right up to the Virginia Capes and flew out to the carrier. They were there in time for night flight operations as required. The COD flew out maintainers, pick up folks from NAS Oceana to provide support and maintenance and loading of ordnance and unloading of ordnance from the aircraft onto the ship that afternoon as well. There were so many people acting on their own initiative. Admiral Dawson out to the carrier. By the time he got up to New York City that night and early the next morning, he had established a link and had a full air picture linking with the two cruisers up the Chesapeake Bay, the John F. Kennedy down that was doing CQ down south of us in Norfolk, and had essentially the air picture for the whole East Coast. He also took the initiative to check in with the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD, to ensure them that there were no blue on blue engagements and that we were available for engagements as required, as well as the missile ships up in the Chesapeake Bay. I also, my immediate mission or commander, operational commander, was General Buck Kernan, Joint Forces Command, and he had just landed in Hungary for a NATO meeting when the strikes hit the World Trade Center. He immediately called me. I told him what we were doing, and he said, "Do whatever you need to do." He got on the aircraft and was headed back. He arrived the morning of the 12th. I also told the command center to notify NORAD and the FAA that the P-3 was en route back. I wanted to make sure there was no blue on blue on General Kernan. I also called again Admiral Dawson and advised him of that fact. So the next morning, or that evening, Mayor Giuliani called me and said, "We really need to provide some encouragement and support for the citizens of New York. And it would be great if we could get that carrier down in close enough for the city to be able to see it." And I passed that on to Admiral Dawson. His advice or his direction to the base CO was get in as close as possible within safety parameters. The next morning, That ship was easily visible from Coney Island and Long Island, and we were there and remained there for a number of days throughout the entire event. So again, initiative on the part of all our people. I really attribute that to the culture of the Navy, being able to respond, commanding officers taking the initiative, not needing a lot of direction. They knew what they had to do and they did it very professionally. My staff recalled that when we first started moving ships and aircraft, that I had told them that I didn't know if I had the authority to send GW to New York City and others up the Chesapeake Bay, et cetera, but that's what we were going to do. My thinking quite simply was that I would rather be fired for doing too much than to be derelict and not doing enough in defense of our country and the fleet itself. I knew General Kernan and our Navy leadership in Washington would understand this and be supportive. I had no idea what our civilian bosses might, how they might react or whether they would accept that. Having said that, I'm convinced to this day it was the right decisions to make, and our fleet staff, and most importantly, our operational commanders from Chief Petty Officer all the way up to 3-star admirals did their work with great professionalism. And with that, I'll await questions from the audience and look forward to responding to those to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to the most important commemoration of the terrorist attacks on 9/11/2001 that may have ever been recorded. You heard from the Navy's direct leadership that day on actions taken in the immediate aftermath of the attack, and now a panel is assembled to take your questions both about 9/11, but also the Navy's future role, which many believe will exponentially increase now that we've departed Afghanistan. On 9/11/2001, I served as the commanding officer of the Navy Command Center Reserve Detachment. I was there, and from my own observations, I calculate that we were only dark about 22 minutes, as evidenced by my command leadership connecting me via RIM pager about their own connectivity with the OPNAV N3, N5 staff and the front office of the Navy. We had deployments to SIDAR as well as to the Navy Annex. Admirals Clark, Natter, Cox, and Admiral Fallon, thank you for joining us for our live discussion today. Our audience is filled with your former shipmates, colleagues, family members, and friends. The first question is addressed to Rear Admiral Sam Cox, then Captain Cox, the N2 Director of Intelligence for the Naval Central Component and the United States Fifth Fleet from Bahrain. Sam, what were your actions immediately following the attacks? Which national intelligence agencies did you reach out to or hear from, such as FBI, CIA, NGA, NRO, or other agencies? And how did your role in such a critical area unfold from your location in Bahrain?
Well, I was in the headquarters in Bahrain when my watch officer broke into a meeting to say that the tower had been hit. As a historian, my first thought was a B-25 crashed into the Empire State Building in July 1945 in morning fog. So we had a lot of things going on in our region that were bad. So a plane crash in New York, however horrific, was not my problem. However, I wrapped up the meeting, fairly quickly, went down to my watch floor just in time to see the plane come in from the right, and my brain goes into this strange slow motion mode where I'm trying to figure out what I'm seeing. First thinking it's a rerun or a replay, but the other tower is already on fire, and then the plane hit. And at that point, it's obvious it's a terrorist attack. My first order out of my mouth was to my, watch officer to get my targeteer and tell him to break out the Afghan target packages because we're going to need them. And then I told my, deputy to take charge of the watch. I'm going up to see the admiral. So by the time I got to the admiral, I'm actually about the last of the senior staff to get there. And Admiral Moore first, asked me, was there a possibility this could be Palestinians? I don't think he really thought that was the case, but the Palestinians had the track record of hijacking aircraft in the 70s and the 80s. And I said, no, sir, this is Al Qaeda. That was, we'd been immersed in Al Qaeda and, force protection the whole 2 years I'd been out there. So it was kind of a no-brainer from our perspective. But Admiral Moore was already issuing a series of orders. We hadn't even gone to the war room. We're actually all in his office. But one of the first was Turnaround Enterprise, which was leaving the AOR. Admiral Morgan had already turned the group around, and frankly, Sandy Winnefeld, the captain, had already turned the ship around. And then we went to Vincent to get them to, they'd already on their own initiative put the pedal to the metal. So we had a number of TLAM shooters in range of Afghanistan at all times as part of a plan to take out bin Laden if National Command Authority ever told us to do so. But by the second night, 12, 13 August, we had 2 aircraft carriers within range of southern Afghanistan. And within, 24 hours, we had 48 TLAM tubes. And within 48, there were 200. Now, whether it would have been a good idea to strike then, probably not, because we already knew the camps had been emptied out. And we discussed actually that morning the implications of the assassination of Ahmad Shah Massoud, the head of the Northern Alliance, which Admiral Moore and I both went, this is a really, really bad sign. So we were kind of expecting something big to happen soon, and it did. But the target set that we had was for an Al Qaeda, to take out the camps, take out bin Laden. There was no plan to take down the Taliban and the entire regime. So the next days were pretty full of working with CENTCOM because the Saudis didn't allow the KAOC in Prince Sultan Air Base to fully participate until only a couple days before the start of the air campaign on 7 October. So we worked with CENTCOM to help create the new target set that we could provide to the aircraft carriers and to the TLAM shooters to move out. We didn't get a whole lot of direct help from any other agency. Between Desert Storm and this operation, we had established, much more robust intel connectivity back to the States, back to CENTCOM and other places. They were busy, CIA and whatnot. They were all feeding CENTCOM. We were plugged into CENTCOM and getting, what we needed that way. So that's about it for that.
Great. Thank you for that great response. And for other members of the panel, and I know some of you have said on the record that, the Pentagon was attacked. Other places were attacked and, you didn't have a lot of information. When did you come to the conclusion that it was likely Al Qaeda, or when did you start receiving actionable and authoritative information? When did that really come together for you? It's for all panelists, but Admiral Natter, would you respond first, please?
Yeah, I quite frankly didn't care who it was. We wanted to go strike whoever was responsible, and that strike direction would come from the National Command Authority through our operational commanders. And we wanted to make sure we were ready to do whatever we were directed to do to respond to this attack. It was that simple as far as I was concerned.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Admiral Fallon?
The next day, by the morning of the next day, it was pretty obvious who had done it through our intel sources. And the big issue in my mind was trying to determine what we could do back from Washington to get the forces ready to respond. It was very soon thereafter that we got the word from the president that we needed to be ready to go. And basically, my memory was, he said, you got 30 days to make this happen. So we then began looking around to see what we could do to help. And it became pretty clear that it's actually the Navy that had the most assets that could be brought to bear, and that's exactly how it played out when things, the attacks in Afghanistan actually began about a month later.
Thank you, sir. Admiral Clark, final thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I would just say I didn't mention before that on the 12th, we had a tank that morning, and because General Shelton was back in town, and of course we knew that it was Al Qaeda. And remember, I'd been to J3 before that, so I was very familiar with what the intelligence looked like. And I remember that meeting in the tank. I just the discussion was, what do you think is on the table, and what about plans and blah blah blah. I was very familiar with the global O plans, and my main concern was, by the way, by the 12th, I'm getting all sorts of communications globally from commanders of other navies and around the world, and I really had a sense that we needed to think our way through this and not have some quick strike that was going to give us a nice, wonderful feeling in our gut, but wasn't going to do anything about dealing with the terrorists. Everybody was ready when we knew what the right target set was to go to work and get on with it.
Thank you, sir. One of the most important strategic messages of all of your comments really goes to the point that our Navy responded immediately with alacrity, with tenacity, with a professionalism. It leads to some other questions. Rear Admiral Mike Mon from the class of '79 and Craig Simons, one of our distinguished naval historians, asked a very similar question. Is there anything you would have done differently after the attacks, even so stated with the great work that we did? And how did 9/11 affect Navy planning on policy and force structure shortly after things settled down? And I'll ask that of you, Admiral Clark, first.
Well, boy, that's a broad question, really. But Mike would know. He was. I created a thing called Deep Blue. I hadn't created it at that point in time, and I created Deep Blue. I don't want to have a long, drawn-out answer here, but during Desert Storm, I was a crisis action team chief as an 06. And I got to watch the way all of the services were responding in crisis. And I was really taken with this capability that the Air Force had called Checkmate. And this was an institution in town. Bill Fallon, by the way, has a fabulous story about from the aviation side of the house on Checkmate, and the thing kind of helped that the Navy got from them. But I had observed the Washington scene and the way they react in crisis, and so if I had it to do all over again, I created something that was like Checkmate for us, and I called it Deep Blue. Staff Reedus started it, Mike came along later, and that whole process was to figure out, really be tuned in without being in the chain of command, which, Goldwater Nichols is all about us. We don't run wars and campaigns from the Pentagon on the Navy staff. But my objective was to figure out how to bring resources to bear, including new technology and so forth. So I would have, if I had it to do all over again, I would have put that in place the day I took over. And then with regard to future force structure, what I would say is this simply. If there was ever a time that it was important for us to be ready, and when the president said the message for the military, be ready, I felt so confident because most people are not aware of the investments that we were making in current readiness. And we were pouring billions into it. And by the time 9/11 occurred, we had already dramatically improved our posture. And I knew that we were on a ramp that was going to put us in a great position to respond. And that position would ultimately get us to the point where the creation of Fleet Response Plan a couple of years later was all an aftermath to formalize and institutionalize a new approach to readiness that had really changed the way we did readiness in the United States Navy. And Natter and his people and the actions they took specifically on the 11th of September and the 12th of September did things within naval aviation that we institutionalized later to create the fleet response plan.
Thank you, sir. Other comments from the panelists?
No, I think that covers it.
Yes, sir. Dr. Bill Dudley's in our audience. He was a former director of Naval History and Heritage Command. Sam's one of his predecessors. He's a distinguished author and friend of our foundation. Asks for Admiral Natter, where did the Navy deploy its units in response to the attacks other than where you already mentioned? What readiness actions did you employ to immediately man, equip, and train our sailors for rapid deployment? And also, Admiral Natter, in the same vein, Captain Phil Resch from Plano, Texas, asked if you have any personal anecdotes about the ordinary sailor who performed extraordinarily from either the active or reserve components from your memories in those first days.
I'll answer the second question first. We were fortunate in that these attacks happened after 8 a.m. So our ships and aircraft squadrons were manned up. People had reported to work, so we didn't have to do an emergency recall. And the sailors and the crews, the officers of the ships and aircraft squadrons were ready to go. We didn't have to ask, they wanted to go. The fact that a junior lieutenant on a console identifies two cruisers, selects them, and provides them direction to go to up the Chesapeake Bay. I had gone away from that console at that point. We didn't have to follow up on our people. They had the initiative. They took it. Everyone from the engineers on the ships to the people walking flight line out at the NAS Oceana, down at other locations. We really, as a fleet, performed, and that cannot happen without everyone from the seaman recruit to or airman to a 3-star admiral. So everybody hit on all cylinders. We didn't have to motivate them. They all knew that we were into a fight now, and they wanted to make sure that we prevailed. With respect to the first question, look, the reality is that our ships, our squadrons are there for one purpose, and that's to defend this country. I think that the motivation of our people enabled those assets that we had to be able to deliver. I just don't think that there's any question that the motivation of our people really made all this happen, and it makes it happen in beyond 9/11. So we had actually other ships that were designated to get underway. As mentioned, we told the hospital ship called MSC, had the hospital ship prepared to get underway. We identified 2 amphibs to go down and load construction equipment to go up and assist. We decided to turn that off when we discovered the real tragedy of the whole Twin Tower problem. The hospital ship, we went ahead and sent it up there. The unsung heroes of that really were the hospital ship provided a great place for the first responders who wanted to work around the clock to go and rest, take a shower, then go back to work. The idea that they would go home across the Staten Island or elsewhere, wherever they lived, was not a possibility. They all wanted to get the job done. So these assets really were instrumental in assisting the city and, in fact, the country in responding to the initial attack. We also looked very closely at deploying other ships that day. For example, my concern was, quite frankly, Galveston, Houston, where our refineries for this country, if they were knocked out, would be tragedy. So we, in the near term, after the attacks, discussed with the CNO and the staff, sending some ships down there to provide some cover, because I want to reiterate here, on that day, no one knew what the attack was all about, how many assets were involved, whether they were going to hit other targets than they actually hit, because the fact is that, as we all know, ships are most vulnerable when they're in port. And I was concerned about our ships and our fleet being attacked like it was at Pearl Harbor. And I wanted to make sure we had assets out there, not only to provide support for any incoming aircraft that we all knew by the end of the day had done what they did, but also anything else out there. So again, the responsiveness of the fleet, the sailors involved were really critical to being able to get out there and do the job that they did.
Thank you, sir. Admiral Fallon, as a two-time combatant commander, any thoughts to pile on to Admiral Natter's comments?
I would just say that shifting back to Washington within 24, 48 hours of this event, we began to start trying to think ahead and be able to respond as required. Admiral Clark already mentioned that we had begun some months earlier to put significant resources into the readiness of the fleet. Now, it takes a while for that to actually take place. So you open the valve and start pouring the money in, but it takes a number of months before that shows up. In fact, that paid off tremendously, not only in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, but a couple of years later in 2003. But I remember distinctly one issue. The Navy back in those days was in a transition, particularly the aviation side, from previous weapons to precision ordnance. We didn't have a whole lot of that material. And it turns out that beginning a few weeks later in Afghanistan, there was a huge demand signal for more and more of this. So getting that specifically highlighted as a place that we needed to get jacked up very quickly paid some dividends. If I could switch to the second question, second part of that question, I have a vivid memory of a little anecdote I'll share with you. That afternoon of 9/11, it's already been mentioned that we moved up to the former Naval Personnel Office up on the hill, and we fell in on the Marine Corps, God bless them, and within hours there was equipment, computers being installed, and so forth. But late in that afternoon, towards the evening, I went outside to get a breath of fresh air, and I walked along a fence line up towards Columbia Boulevard, and what did I see but a camper there, a modified camper with windows cut out of it. And I walked over, and what I found was exactly that, a camper that had been brought up from Norfolk within hours of the impact on the Pentagon by a number of retired chief petty officers who just wanted to do something to help. And they talked themselves inside the fence, and they set this thing up to give water and coffee and soft drinks and snacks to anybody that needed a break. And they just stayed there for weeks. They did it on their own nickel, their own initiative. And this was in place by 4 or 5 o'clock that afternoon. Indicative, I think, of the response to people all over the country and the world, in fact. But these were former fleet sailors that wanted to help out. And there were lots and lots of stories like that during those next couple of days. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Admiral Clark or Admiral Cox, anything to pile on?
Let me just plug in two things really. Number one, when I knew I was going to be the CNO, I went and read my predecessor's testimony before Congress. Spent a great deal of time talking about the bathtub readiness model. And I don't think people really realize how devastating that could be. That, we peak up for deployment, we get them ready to go, and then when they come back, they fall down into the C4 category, and really a tough way to do life, and you can't respond when that happens. That was imposed on the U.S. military act called the Gramm-Rudman Act, that was post-Soviet Union, that was going to, be the big peace dividend thing. And I believe that it's really important looking at this time in history to understand what that was all about. Number two, on the 12th, one of my calls was to Jim Loy. Admiral Jim Loy was the Commandant of the Coast Guard. 2 weeks before 9/11, we had signed something that exists in the system, and it's a memorandum of agreement and understanding between the Coast Guard and the Navy, and it had been written for years, and it needed to be periodically updated, and it was time to do that. And basically that document said that in time of war, the Coast Guard would come and work for the Navy. As soon as this happened, I knew that we were in a different thing, and I called Jim and I said, Jim, what can I do for you? Obviously, you have a role here that is not spelled out in our joint memorandum. Well, he wasn't bashful. He said immediately, I want the PCs, patrol coastals, and you all will dig back in your history. You'll recall what those were all about. Anyway, we ended up giving them to him. Over time, we took some of them back. But so at that point in time, exactly in response to the question, we were thinking about things, you know, what is it we should be doing right now? And it could have dealt with a lot of different possibilities, but I throw that in for what it's worth.
Thank you, sir. Sam, any final thought on that question?
Yeah, I would just add that I think the readiness of the carriers and the surface ships that were out there was actually pretty extraordinary. And some of the enhancements that have been made over the years, you know, since Desert Storm, especially to the F-14 Tomcat, that enabled them to act as a airborne forward air control, filled a critical gap between the time when pretty much all the Taliban fixed targets had been destroyed and before the special forces could get into the ground. They on the ground in northern Afghanistan, and they had much problem due to weather and Taliban fire at the LZs. So the F-14s played a critical role. The Navy jets, you know, the readiness met, you know, every CAOC requirement was met. And we had more capacity if there had been more tanking. And that was the only thing where we actually needed, you know, help with was land-based tanking. But, you know, I would just point out the Air Force tactical jets, you know, couldn't get into the fight until 10 days after the air campaign started. And they're only flying, you know, 2 F-15s a day all the way from Kuwait. So this was a Navy aviation show. 75% of the sorties during the first 3 months of the campaign were Navy carrier jets. One Marine squadron was in there too, so they were playing a part. But they played a critical, decisive role at multiple points in the campaign. So in my view, this is the Navy, and especially Navy aviation, is one of their finest hours.
Thank you for that important contribution. Again, underscoring. Yes, sir.
I want to throw a pitch in here. Sam has written 2 really incredible historical documents that document his time as the J2 out there at NAVCENT, and I highly recommend them to readers.
Yes, sir. And I've of course have read them, and I will put them in our next Thursday tidings. I think we've already published them once, but we'll do it again because I think it's very topical, and Sam's great remarks will be very titillating to the audience if they haven't read them. Next question is for you, Admiral Clark, and it comes from Captain Dale Kid Loomy, classmate and former roommate of Sam Cox. You have previously mentioned that in your meetings with President Bush that the president foresaw early on that the war on terror was going to be a time frame that opened the eyes on the terrorism challenges that many may not have realized. Can you further describe the president's comments or leadership examples to national security leadership as the great intelligence information unfolded?
Well, so I'll be careful the way I answer this because a lot of those discussions were things that I'm not going to be public about. But I think that it was really clear. My thought goes to something that's just happened. I heard on the Sunday talk shows Sunday that the longest war that we've ever been in Afghanistan is over. Well, if there's anything that I learned during my time serving, and when the president decided to give this whole campaign this long-term focus called the global war on terror, is that the war in Afghanistan is not over. It's just gone through another phase because this thing isn't going to stop. And if you study the history of the challenges between the radical element of the Islamic world, we know that there have been elements of this on the face of the earth for a long time. Bush made it clear to us that this was not going to be over in 5 minutes. This wasn't something that you could launch a bunch of TLAMs at and the problem was going to go away. And I thought that there was if you're a senior officer in the military and when you get to that level, you always are in touch with things that are being said in the policy world that capture your attention. On the 20th, there was another line in his speech that he said, and we're talking about we're going to go after terrorists worldwide. And then he added this phrase, and all who harbor them. When those words came out of his mouth, it was clear that we were upping the ante in a huge way. And so from the very beginning, the discussion were not about quick short-term fixes. It wasn't going to work out that way. And I guess that's the best way that I can answer that today.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And really kind of an extension back to Sam, Admiral Cox. Did you feel from Bahrain the long arm of civilian leadership, either via POTUS or from the Secretary of Defense, or were you just doing your job out there, ops normal?
Well, not directly. I mean, the first warning order we got from Central Command, about 2 or 3 days after the attacks was, I would characterize it as sling a few TLAMs into Afghanistan and then invade Iraq, which provoked considerable consternation on our part because we thought that was a really dumb idea. Fortunately, I think there was some opposition to that, at least at that time, on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So that got shelved, although there was an undercurrent of, don't use up all the TLAMs because we have something for them to do, afterwards. But no, we didn't experience, anything direct from Washington on at least on that score.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from Admirals Natter or Fallon?
Nope. All good here.
Good. So this is kind of more of a contemporary question, but it's an important one, and a lot of people really are concerned about it. And this one comes from Dr. Jennifer London, whom we're very happy to have in our audience today. And she comments on remarks made by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, when he opined recently that we can expect terrorist attacks originating from Afghanistan in the time frame of 12, 24, or 36 months. What are your thoughts on this timeline, and what should we be doing now to prepare against such attacks? And it really goes to, in the old model, it was an away game, and now maybe we're looking at a home game as it concerns terrorism. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I've got a couple of thoughts. Number one, we already have a terrorist problem we're trying to deal with in East Africa, and that is a very serious problem. In Afghanistan, whether the Taliban harbor the Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, or if they don't, is going to be important. And of course, the Pakistanis' response to that eventuality also is going to be a big issue. So I think a lot of it depends on what the Taliban do with respect to terrorism and exporting terrorism and harboring terrorists. If you add that to the challenge we already have in East Africa and elsewhere, terrorism is not a thing of the past and a threat to the United States.
Yes, sir. Sam Cox, natural question for you with your background.
Yeah, I would just go, as Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over, and it ain't over. All of the socio-economic, political, religious factors that were in effect in 2001, none of them have been fixed in the region. So whether it's son of Al-Qaeda or grandson of Al-Qaeda, right now, ISIS-K, K stands for Khorasan, which is an ancient term for Afghanistan. And that's where the extremists believe that, the final day of judgment, the end times, will come from Khorasan to, so these guys are really into that kind of stuff. So they're still looking to, how do we get to the final jihad? And one way or another, they're going to keep at it.
Thank you. Admiral Fallon.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. Afghanistan was the site, if you recall in history, where bin Laden actually went to work in energizing adherence to his particular philosophy of anti-Western activities. This goes back to the 1980s. And so it makes it all the more important and sad that we've kind of walked away from Afghanistan now, because it wasn't just that this was the site where bin Laden began, but over the years, he nurtured a growing group of folks who were adherents to his philosophy, and they're still there. And this, the atmosphere and the environmentals in that part of the world, particularly the rough territory of Afghanistan, aren't going to disappear. And the fact that now you've got not just a very sketchy, limited governance back in charge, but one that's actually blind philosophically and religiously to many of the ideas that originally were spawned there, I think is not a good sign. So I'd expect, unfortunately, more of the same on the bad news side over the coming years.
Yes, sir. Admiral Clark, any final thought on that question?
You bet. I think Dr. London's question is a really good one, and I would just add that the only part of this that I would contest is the timeline. If you had asked me on the anniversary of 9/11 on any given year from 20 years ago to single them off one at a time and said, do you have a timeline on when the next big attack is going to take place? I would say, no, I do not. And I believe that it's there's one danger in timelines, and you start looking at that as the outside of the envelope, that I have a year, I got a 2 or something like that. I don't believe in this fight you can afford to look at it like that. I think we have to be looking for it every single day. And I believe that if you don't do that, then you find yourself, well, first of all, the progress that's made on this is made by people. And when we delay a sense of urgency, that's always unhealthy. I believe that the element, first of all, Bill Fallon's a former CENTCOM commander. He knows that theater way better than I do. He's invested a part of his life in the details of it all. I believe the threat is there, and it's going to be there throughout the rest of my life. That's what I believe.
Yes, sir. Thank you. A member of our audience is Dr. Len Cavney, and he's a national treasure as a scientist, engineer, and physicist in many areas, but most specifically in all instantiations of our Missile Defense Agency, from SDIO to BIMDO to the large research, small development, to the small research, large development. He's well known by Rod Rempt and everyone really in any leadership, Kate Page, whoever you could choose. And anecdotally, he was 10 or 11 years old and lived in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. His father was a Year Group 29 person. And his next door neighbor, anecdotally, in housing was Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton. Incredible story. But Dr. Cavney, thank you for joining us today. His question is forged and steeped in his personal history with both Pearl Harbor and 9/11, is exhorting us to never forget. How, in your opinions, do we keep such memories in the forefront of our training readiness and national policy agendas? Or is it just stipulated that we'll never forget? Admiral Natter, first to you.
Well, many on this circuit don't remember the Victory at Sea shows that we used to all watch when we were kids, and that I required the crew to watch before every movie in the evening. That's important because that establishes the culture of who we are. I would suggest that we, the leadership of the Navy today, needs to ensure that the lessons we learn, not only from the attack, but also the response to those attacks, are not forgotten by our active duty folks. And that's going to be an important responsibility for our leadership, because if we start just focusing on the future, focusing on technology, focusing on what we think we can deliver, without that background, without that understanding of who we are, how we arrived at what we are as a service, we won't be responsible and responsive.
Thank you, sir. Any thoughts from any other panelists on that one?
One thought, the key word is intentionality, and that's why I congratulate the foundation for taking this on. I think it's important. I also think the natural human response to these kind of things is to push them away from our memory, because they're not always pleasant. But I think, again, BZ to the Historical Foundation for deciding to host us today.
Admiral Nimitz once remarked about his Navy War College experience prior to World War II, where he stated that nothing we faced in World War II was uncovered by our preparations other than the kamikaze or asymmetrical threat. In your collective opinions, beginning with Sam Cox, do you think senior combatant commanders can say the same thing in today's fast-paced and asymmetrical world? And to take it a step further from one of our midshipmen who won our Jack London and Admiral Fallon and Naval Academy Superintendent's leadership essay contest, are we training, totally correctly, with the cyber, the artificial intelligence, machine learning? Are we training properly? And how would you answer that question?
Well, I mean, current training's a bit out of my lane, now, but, my sense is that much of it is on track, but in some ways you don't know what you don't know. And, you go to Pearl Harbor, we had no idea the Japanese had figured out how to drop torpedoes in that shallow water, and they'd only figured out how to do it a month beforehand. So, I mean, the options, I think there's a much broader range for us to be surprised by the rapid changes in technology that are creating, the capability for weapons of mass destruction that aren't WMD as we understand it, today, but with artificial intelligence and nanotechnology and rolling off, bios, all that stuff. We could easily get surprised still.
Any other thoughts from any other panelists?
I certainly have an input. I think that what was done before World War II in Newport, Rhode Island at the War College was magnificent. I think that there are a lot of things that go on today that people just take for granted and don't think about it in terms of the way it would compare. There is, Sam says it just exactly right. There's too much out there to do a real live war game in big steps that cover sometimes weeks or months between events. It's happening too fast. And we have that kind of capability. Think about the Joint Warfare Center that was down in Norfolk under Joint Forces Command. I'm out of touch with exactly where all of those capabilities went when JIFCOM was disestablished. But in the Navy itself, when we work up a battle group to go to the other side of the earth and do its business, we put the battle group commanders, the combatant commander, the strike group commanders, we put them under a lot of stress and strain to test the limits of them and their team. It can only happen now with the high-speed kind of capabilities that we can replicate. And I'm not current on the level of sophistication, but I know that it's out there. And so I think that what that means is that we've got to keep working that side of the challenge, because if we don't test ourselves before the event, we'll be tested in a very unsatisfactory way after the event. I think we have the means. It's all about committing the resources to it and getting the people in the right position to experience it.
Admiral Natter, and then we'll give Admiral Fallon the last word.
Yeah, I just think that certainly Admiral Nimitz was right. The wargaming process up in Newport was excellent planning for us with respect to strategy and general operations against potential threat, which was Japan. Having said that, we never envisioned the carrier being the main body. It was always the battleship, and the carrier aviation was going to be scouting. Well, that got turned on its ear because of two things. One was the capability and technology of naval aviation, both for us and the Japanese. And secondly, they sank the wrong ships. They sank the battleships at Pearl Harbor, which required us to utilize our carriers as the main body. Additionally, submarines. Our submarines were not very good at the beginning of World War II, and many of our commanders, quite frankly, were not very good. Where we really improved was in the technology of both of the torpedoes eventually, it took a long time, and also the ships themselves. And more importantly, the young officers they put in there as commanding officers who were very aggressive and didn't take as a number one priority avoiding detection. Hell, they surfaced and attacked. That's not avoiding detection. So my point, quite simply, is we have to try and develop, acquire, and train in the best technologies available, possible. Because when the combat happens, you never know how you're going to use those systems. But if you've got the very best out there, you've got very competent crews who know how to use them, then we can change the work or the requirements of those systems. A good example is when we did special ops off one of our carriers in the Arabian Gulf. That's a great example. But most importantly, we've got to develop technology. We've got to be able to use it. Wargaming, the one thing I would do is make the red team people who we put into those positions the most devious, evil, smartest people we can find, and to come up with something that makes sense to them, not us. Because remember, the enemy always has a vote in what happens.
Yes, sir. And Admiral Fallon.
A couple of points. One, as a former combatant commander, the reality is that you go to war, you go to whatever operation you're tasked with the assets you've got in hand. You don't have the time to go back and create something new or to do something other than what do I have, what are the capabilities, and so how do you put yourself in the best position to have the broadest set of options. And it's back to Navy, it seems to me. First of all, each element within the Navy's got specific responsibilities for different things. So the Washington crowd is supposed to be resourcing and thinking about future conflict, building capabilities that are going to be available in future years. And they need to really be attuned to that and paying attention to the intelligence that comes along to see what can be done. The other thought, Admiral Clark, I just want to foot stomp on a couple of things that Admiral Clark said. First of all, the readiness of our forces. If you give me assets that are ready and capable to do the missions for which those forces have been designed, then I'm going to have a pretty good leg up on things. Second piece is the training piece. If those assets have been stressed and really put through their paces, so they have been forced to look at every dimension of their resources and figure out how to use them, then I think we'll be in pretty good shape. And to something that Admiral Clark mentioned, I don't know what's happened back in the 90s when we were back in the fleet. Fleet Forces, or JFCOM rather, Joint Forces Command, had a very robust training program for operational level officers, not junior officers, not 4 stars, but the 2 and 3 stars that actually conduct operations around the world. And that was invaluable, I believe, in preparing us for the next couple of decades. I don't know where that is now, but I note that it's gone. I think re-emphasizing that would be very helpful to our fleet and our country as we look to the future.
Thank you, sir. We have an extraordinarily large number of questions unasked, and I'm going to kind of just summarize them just for your personal edification, but also to let them know that I didn't just ignore this. But Captain Bill Perenboom from the great class of 57 asks about, did 9/11 justify the Iraq War? And in the context of the PAL doctrine, what was the objective of the war in Afghanistan? And then questions come together from Fleet Master Chief Scott Benning, formerly of the United States Fleet Forces Command, asks which leaders impressed you most through this devastating ordeal. There was a retired senior chief who was a CPO select during 9/11, and he shares that the training session continued so that we showed continuity of routine operations, and I think that's an important point. A Navy lieutenant asks, he first thanks everyone for their service and leadership, but he says, since 9/11, the ops tempo of the sea service has taken its toll on our personnel. What are your thoughts on the increased demand on the URL, unrestricted line officers of all warfare specialties, that makes retention so difficult? Our longest serving commander of Navy District Washington and plank owner of Commander of Navy Installations Command and former shipmate of mine, Rear Admiral Chris Weaver, comments that it was an honor for him to work with Admirals Clark and Fallon in the Navy's response to the attack. And I think we can all agree that Chris Weaver's work was brilliant in those days. Retired Captain Karen Vernaza thanks you for your brilliant service on our behalf. Anyway, it goes on, and we've got questions from our board members in that. And the reason I kind of build on these is to give attribution to some people who were very thoughtful and considerate in how they participated. But I'd like to now just turn this back over to each of you for your final comments, and then we'll just wrap the session up in the interest of the time that we promised our audience. So I'm going to start with Sam, and then go to Admiral Natter and Admiral Clark, and then as our chairman, Admiral Fallon, to wrap up what your final thoughts, some of which may be informed by some of the questions that you just received. So Sam, for you.
Well, first, it's an incredible honor to be on the same stage with this group of distinguished naval officers, Call Cotton or whatever you want to call it. But I think my final comment would be is that the Navy reacted, extremely well to 9/11, both the operations off the East Coast and in the North Arabian Sea, displaying the initiative that goes back to our genetic roots in terms of not waiting for direction from higher authority to do the right thing and do what needed to be done. So I think all of that was successful. If I were to, close off the campaign in Afghanistan was actually pretty brilliantly executed, despite the fact there was no plan at the start. But at the end, I think our aversion to casualties had become so overpowering that it affected some of the decisions at the end, where we, in effect, allowed bin Laden and Mullah Omar and others to escape rather than risking putting the Marines or airborne troops into the passes to keep them out. And I think, even at the time, we believed that was a big problem. And I think it was the strategic failure of the campaign in basically not closing with and destroying the enemy when you have the chance, and you give them the opportunity to recuperate so they can fight another day or another 20 years. And we just paid for that. So that'd be just my closing comment.
Thank you, sir. Admiral Natter.
Well, with respect to the first question, we had no choice but to respond to the attacks of 9/11. We as a nation could not have done otherwise. So I think the response was absolutely appropriate. I think we were, in essence, very successful at going after bin Laden. I wish we had stopped him and taken him out before he made it into Pakistan. I think that was a very bad decision by the leadership of our country not to do that. That provided an excuse for us to remain in Afghanistan. And I do not think that nation building over there is, if we ever attempt to do it again, is ever going to end up nicely. The history shows us otherwise. But I do think that we can establish a presence there appropriately, working with whoever the government is, both in Pakistan and whatever ends up running Afghanistan, to ensure that terrorists don't have a free hand at planning and then executing an attack on us. Lastly, I would say that our most valuable asset in the war on terror, and indeed in all our combat operations, is intelligence. Not only intelligence at the military level, but intelligence with our allies at the national level. The idea that we've been able to pick up terrorists coming across the border from Canada. We've worked with our allies in Europe, in New Zealand, Australia, to work this at a really international level is the real solution to defending ourselves. We've got to do it sometimes kinetically, but you can't do it effectively kinetically unless you've got very good intelligence supporting your decisions.
Thank you, sir. Admiral Clark.
Yeah, there are so many important points and questions to address in those that you read off. Let me just start by saying Chris Weaver was one of the real heroes helping us get our headquarters put together. There's never enough time to tell all the story, but when I gave the direction to establish the headquarters by tomorrow morning, it meant a set of phones someplace and a way to interact with other members of the team. But in a week, he had us in Crystal City, and the computer companies were raining capabilities on us. Chris was he was chosen for a time like that, and so appreciate that kind of the innovation wasn't all just at sea; it was going on all over the place. I do want to focus in on the op-tempo question, and I think that it really is a very good point. And I recall having discussions with myself on this because we were, our policy was if your deployment is X and your time home is 2X. And I don't care, it happened to be 6 months then, but that's not the point. The point was we were constantly trying to protect our people so that we didn't wear them out. The fact is, when we went to war, it was real clear to me that there were going to be times when we were going to break that model. And over time, it became more and more challenging. Most people really don't understand. First of all, they know the history of how this all unfolded. And in the Iraq case, we were going to come home when we had completed the pieces of it that were laid out in the initial plan. This thing took on a life of its own and a different approach longer term. But I believe this, and I alluded to it briefly in the Afghanistan comment. The war isn't over with Afghanistan because we've brought people home. This war is going to go on and on. And so we have to develop human capital models that allow us to sustain our efforts. Because if we can't sustain, I came to believe that this whole thing about not just being able to persevere, but to, one of my favorite words became persistence. And if we cannot sustain persistent presence and impact in a field of endeavor, we will not be successful. And so I think that the voice needs to be heard loud and clear how all of the military deals with that. As the campaign went on in the global war on terrorism, the things turned to the Navy that the Navy was not involved in. Sonny, you're so tuned in on the whole issue of individual augmentees and all that goes with that. The sacrifices were many. And I believe that we must understand that the sacrifices are going to continue. But the human capital strategy and structure and making sure that people are provided for and that they can sustain themselves in service is a vital requirement for our military.
And thank you, sir. And the last word, Admiral Fallon, before we close.
We could spend hours, I think, just diving into the details of some of the terrific questions. We're out of time. I'd just like to wrap up with underlining a couple things Admiral Clark just said about the need to have resources that are able to persist on target. And the other word that comes to mind is resilience, that we build into our training programs and our hardware capabilities, our capability to actually have a lasting impact. And to wrap up, 9/11 is a day that's certainly not going to be forgotten by any of our generation or the generations, plural, that were alive during that day. And my hope and plea would be that we take advantage of the memories to really learn the lessons that came out of 9/11 and the aftermath, and to apply those as we go to the future. So use this as a springboard to better thinking and good decisions as we go into the future. And again, underlining the importance of particularly our naval history and the things that there's very little under the sun that's new except new technology. People and what they do, how they act, have been around for thousands of years. The question is, can we take advantage of the lessons that we've absorbed during this time to do better in the future? So I'll leave you with that. Thanks very much for our panelists. Really, really wonderful that you take the time to do this. And to the audience, keep stroking, and let's kick the can on history and try to continue to make sure we resource this so that the future generations are able to take these lessons learned that we have. Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir. The audience included, and it's I would be remiss if I didn't mention, but there's a lot of active duty, including the Chief of Naval Personnel, who sent me a kind note, John Nowell, a real, probably one of the best. And when Admiral Clark talks about human capital strategies, science of learning, talent acquisition and retention, he's one of the great leaders of that that we've ever had. And that's alongside guys like John Harvey and other people. But I think to the audience, I think you will agree that our program today was very special. And I would like to thank our participants for their leadership during a time that will be studied, analyzed, assessed, and reflected upon forever. I thank you, our audience, for not only your great questions, but for your own service to our Navy and nation during 9/11 and operations enduring an Iraqi freedom. I personally have reflected on those lost in the Navy Command Center. I knew them well and remember them fondly. I try to visit their graves at Arlington National Cemetery several times a year. If you appreciated our webinar today, please consider the following. Join our foundation through our website at www.navyhistory.org. And if you're viewing this via YouTube, which should be up later this afternoon, please hit the like, subscribe, and bell buttons to be alerted to our foundation's future content. Let us now have a moment of silence and solemnly remember those Navy personnel lost on 9/11/2001. Thank you for watching.